A 76-year-old man with a plastic visitor badge and a windbreaker from a hardware store walks across a flight line, stops in front of a $40 million fighter jet that an entire maintenance crew has been unable to start for 2 days, reaches into the engine intake area with his left hand, and does something that takes less than 4 seconds. The jet engine spools, the turbine catches, the exhaust cone glows orange, and the sound rolls across the tarmac like thunder breaking open the sky. 16 mechanics, 3 engineers, and a squadron commander are standing behind him. Nobody moves, nobody speaks. One of the airmen, a 23-year-old avionics specialist who has been crawling through that aircraft's guts since Monday morning, later tells his supervisor that he felt his entire career rearrange itself in the time it took that old man to straighten up, wipe his hand on his pants and say, "Your bleed air valve was stuck. Probably has been for a while." If you believe that experience deserves more respect than rank, comment the word craftsman right now. Because what happened at Shaw Air Force Base that Wednesday changed the way an entire fighter squadron thinks about the men who built the legacy they inherited. Gerald Arthur Fisk did not intend to fix anything that day. He did not intend to be on the flight line at all. He was at Shaw Air Force Base in Sumter, South Carolina, because the 20th Fighter Wing was hosting a heritage event for Vietnam-era veterans, a gesture organised by the wing commander, Colonel Diana Prescott, who believed that the men and women who had maintained and flown Cold War and Vietnam-era aircraft deserved to see what their work had become. Gerald had received his invitation through the Air Force Association chapter in Columbia. He almost did not come. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 14 months earlier, and Gerald had spent most of that time in a quiet fog, eating meals he did not taste, watching television he did not follow, and sitting on a porch that felt too large for one person. His daughter, Christine, had called him 3 times about the invitation. The 3rd time, she said, "Dad, you need to get out of that house before it swallows you." Gerald said fine. He drove the 90 minutes to Shaw in a pickup truck that was older than most of the airmen on the base, and arrived at the visitor centre at 8 in the morning wearing pressed khakis, a navy windbreaker with the logo of a Lowe's hardware store where he had worked part-time after retirement, and a look on his face that suggested he was already calculating when he could leave. The heritage tour was scheduled to begin at 9. A public affairs officer named Lieutenant Carla Moreno gathered the group of 14 veterans in a briefing room and gave them an overview of the 20th Fighter Wing's current mission, its aircraft, and its role in global combat operations. The veterans ranged in age from 71 to 84. Most of them had served as ground crew, maintenance specialists, or support personnel during the Vietnam era. A few had been aircrew. Gerald sat in the back row, arms folded, listening politely but not asking questions. Moreno noticed him because he was the only one who did not seem impressed by the promotional video showing F-16s launching from the runway in full afterburner. Every other veteran leaned forward or murmured something to the person next to them. Gerald watched the screen with the flat, evaluative expression of a man who had seen the real thing and did not need the soundtrack. The tour moved to the flight line at 10. Moreno led the group across the tarmac toward a row of F-16C Fighting Falcons parked in their shelters. The veterans walked slowly, some with canes, some assisted by younger family members who had come along. Gerald walked alone, slightly behind the group, his eyes moving constantly across the aircraft, the ground equipment, the tool carts, the way the crew chiefs had their panels arranged. He was reading the flight line the way a man reads a familiar book, in a language he has not spoken for decades but has never forgotten. As the group approached Shelter 7, they passed a maintenance crew gathered around a single F-16 that was clearly not part of the tour. This aircraft, tail number 88-0421, was surrounded by tool stands, diagnostic carts, open access panels, and the unmistakable atmosphere of frustration. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Nate Herrera, was standing near the nose with a tablet in one hand and a look on his face that Gerald recognized instantly. It was the look of a man who had tried everything he knew and was running out of ideas. The problem with tail number 88-0421 had started 2 days earlier. During a routine engine run, the Pratt & Whitney F100 turbofan had failed to complete its start sequence. The engine would spool to approximately 18% RPM and then stall, dropping back to 0 with a shudder that the crew could feel through the concrete. Herrera's team had followed the technical order checklist methodically. They had checked the fuel system, inspecting the main fuel control, the fuel pump, and the fuel oil heat exchanger. They had tested the ignition system, replacing the igniter plugs and verifying the exciter box output. They had run diagnostics on the digital engine control unit, pulling fault codes that pointed to nothing conclusive. They had inspected the starter, the gearbox, and the jet fuel starter. On the second day, they brought in Staff Sergeant Tina Cordero from the propulsion flight, a specialist with 8 years on F-16 engines, who spent 4 hours tracing wiring harnesses and testing sensors. She found nothing. They brought in a civilian technical representative from Pratt & Whitney, a field engineer named David Coe, who flew in from the company's support office at Langley. Coe spent an entire afternoon running his own diagnostic protocols. He identified what he believed was an intermittent fault in the engine's hydromechanical unit and recommended replacing it, a procedure that would take the aircraft off the line for a minimum of 5 days and cost the squadron a significant portion of its quarterly maintenance budget. Herrera was not convinced. Coe was not certain. And Colonel Prescott, who needed every flyable jet she could get for an upcoming readiness exercise, was not happy. Gerald saw all of this from 50 feet away as the tour group walked past. He saw the open panels, he saw the diagnostic carts, he saw the way Herrera was staring at the tablet without really reading it, and he saw something else. He stopped walking. Lieutenant Moreno, who was at the front of the group describing the F-16's combat radius, did not notice, but the veteran walking next to Gerald, a former B-52 crew chief named Hal Denton, did. Hal looked at Gerald and said, "You see something?" Gerald did not answer immediately. He was staring at the left side of the aircraft, at a section of the fuselage near the engine intake, with an intensity that made Hal take a half step back. Then Gerald said, very quietly, almost to himself, "That's a bleed air problem." Hal frowned. "How can you tell from here?" Gerald pointed. "See that panel? The one with the 2 fasteners missing on the lower edge. That's the compressor bleed air access panel. It's sitting about a 1/4 inch proud of the fuselage line. That means somebody opened it, inspected whatever's behind it, and closed it without getting the valve back to its full seat. The valve is hanging up. That's why the engine won't complete the start sequence. Compressor bleed air is dumping overboard during spool up and the engine can't build enough core pressure to sustain combustion past 18%. Hal stared at him. Gerald was still looking at the aircraft. Then he looked at Hal and said, "I need to talk to that crew chief." What happened next became the subject of a story that was retold so many times at Shaw Air Force Base that within 6 months there were at least 3 versions, each slightly more embellished than the last. But the facts, as documented in the maintenance log and confirmed by multiple witnesses, are these. Gerald Fisk separated from the tour group and walked toward Shelter 7. Moreno saw him and called out, but Gerald either did not hear her or did not stop. Herrera saw an elderly civilian in a hardware store windbreaker approaching his aircraft and moved to intercept him. Gerald introduced himself, said he was a veteran on the Heritage Tour, apologized for the interruption, and said he thought he knew what was wrong with the engine. Herrera, who had been awake for 16 hours and was facing the prospect of a 5-day engine teardown, was not in the mood for unsolicited advice from a visitor. He thanked Gerald politely and said the aircraft was in the hands of qualified personnel. Gerald nodded and said he understood. Then he said, "Sergeant, I'm not trying to step on anyone, but you've got a bleed air valve that's not seating. I can see it from the panel alignment. If you open that panel and check the valve actuator arm, I think you're going to find it's hung up on a burr or a piece of debris in the track. It's a 5-minute fix. I've seen it 100 times. Herrera looked at him. He looked at the panel Gerald was pointing to. He looked back at Gerald. Then he asked the question that everyone on the flight line would eventually ask. "Sir, how do you know that?" Gerald said he used to work on jet engines. Herrera asked which engines. Gerald said the F-100. Herrera's expression changed. The F-100 was the engine sitting inside the aircraft behind him. The same Pratt & Whitney turbofan that had been refusing to start for 48 hours. Herrera asked Gerald where he had worked on them. Gerald said he had been in the Air Force. Herrera asked when. Gerald said a long time ago. There was something in his voice, the same flat quietness that hid more than it revealed, that made Herrera pause. He looked at Gerald's hands. They were the hands of a mechanic, not soft, not smooth, scarred across the knuckles with the kind of permanent grease staining in the creases of the fingers that no amount of soap ever fully removes. Those were hands that had spent decades inside machines. Herrera made a decision. He said, "Show me." Gerald walked to the aircraft. He did not touch anything without asking first. He pointed to the compressor bleed air access panel on the left side of the fuselage and asked Herrera to open it. Herrera removed the 2 fasteners, and when the panel came off, Gerald leaned in and looked. He did not use a flashlight. He did not use a mirror or a borescope. He tilted his head, squinted, and reached in with his left hand. His right hand, Herrera noticed, stayed at his side. It did not move at all. Gerald's fingers found the bleed air valve actuator arm, a mechanical linkage about the size of a man's index finger, and he pressed it. There was a small metallic click. Gerald withdrew his hand and said, "There." The actuator arm was hanging on a carbon deposit in the track, probably built up over the last few hundred hours. Somebody inspected it and put the panel back on but didn't make sure the arm returned to full closed. It was sitting about 2 millimeters off seat. That's enough to dump bleed air during start and starve the combustor. Herrera stared at the valve. He could see it now, seated flush, exactly where it was supposed to be. He pulled out his flashlight and looked at the track. There was a thin ridge of black carbon build-up along the guide rail, barely visible, exactly where Gerald had described. Cordero, who had come over when she saw the visitor near the aircraft, looked at it and closed her eyes for a moment. She had inspected that panel the day before. She had looked at that valve. She had not seen the carbon ridge because it was less than a millimeter thick and the same colour as the surrounding metal. She had not physically cycled the actuator arm because the technical order did not specifically call for it in the troubleshooting sequence she was following. Gerald had seen it from 50 feet away based on a 1/4-inch misalignment of an access panel. Herrera told his crew to prepare for an engine run. He closed the panel, replaced the fasteners, and followed the standard start procedure. The digital engine control initiated the sequence. The starter engaged. The turbine began to spool. It passed 10%, 12, 15, 18, the point where the engine had stalled every time for 2 days. It kept climbing, 22%, 25. The fuel flow increased. The exhaust gas temperature rose. The combustor lit with a deep, concussive thump that everyone on the flight line felt in their ribs. The RPM climbed through 40, 50, 60%, and the engine settled into a smooth, sustained idle with a sound like controlled thunder. Herrera watched the instruments stabilize and then turned around. Gerald was standing about 20 feet behind the aircraft, hands in the pockets of his windbreaker, watching the exhaust shimmer with the satisfied expression of a man listening to a piece of music he had not heard in a long time but knew by heart. The maintenance crew stood in a ragged semicircle around him, and for a moment nobody said anything. The engine was running. 2 days of troubleshooting, a civilian tech rep flight, a recommended 5-day teardown, and the answer had been a carbon deposit the size of a grain of rice, and an old man who knew where to look. Staff Sergeant Cordero was the first one to walk over to him. She extended her hand and said, "Sir, I owe you an apology. I looked at that valve yesterday and missed it." Gerald shook her hand and said, "You didn't miss anything. The tech data didn't tell you to cycle the arm, so you didn't cycle it. That's not your fault. That's a gap in the procedure. I only know about it because I spent 30 years learning every way that valve can fail, and I've seen that carbon build-up trick about a dozen times. It doesn't show up in the manuals because it's not common enough to make the checklist. But when it happens, it'll fool you every time." Cordero asked him how he could see the panel misalignment from 50 feet away. Gerald smiled for the first time that day and said, "Sweetheart, when you've stared at the same airframe for 30 years, you know what it's supposed to look like. When something's off by a 1/4 inch, it might as well be a flashing light." Herrera radioed the squadron maintenance officer, Captain James Odom, and reported the aircraft status. Odom asked how the problem had been resolved. Herrera hesitated, then said a civilian visitor had identified the fault. There was a pause on the radio. Odom asked Herrera to repeat that. Herrera repeated it. Odom said he was on his way. By the time Odom arrived, the word had already reached Colonel Prescott, who was in her office reviewing the readiness exercise timeline and doing math she did not enjoy about how many jets she would have available. Her executive officer knocked on her door and said, "Ma'am, 0421 is running." Prescott looked up. "Since when?" "Since about 10 minutes ago. One of the Heritage Tour veterans fixed it." Prescott set down her pen and said, "Tell me everything." The story that emerged over the next hour filled in the details that Gerald had been so reluctant to provide himself. Gerald Arthur Fisk had enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1966 at the age of 18. He was trained as a jet engine mechanic at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois and was subsequently assigned to the 388th Tactical Fighter Wing at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand, where he maintained F-105 Thunder Chiefs flying combat missions over North Vietnam. The F-105 was powered by a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet, a brutally powerful engine that required constant expert maintenance in conditions that included tropical heat, monsoon humidity, combat damage, and supply chains that were perpetually strained. Gerald spent 2 tours at Korat. During that time, he developed a reputation as the mechanic you brought impossible problems to. Aircraft that other crew chiefs had written off as unflyable came back to life under Gerald's hands. He could diagnose engine faults by sound alone, identifying a bad bearing or a misaligned compressor blade by standing near the intake and listening to the spool up the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. His maintenance chief at Korat, a master sergeant named Willard Bull Parsons, wrote in Gerald's performance report that Airman Fisk had an understanding of jet propulsion that borders on the intuitive, and that he was the finest engine man I have encountered in 22 years of Air Force service. After Vietnam, Gerald remained in the Air Force and transitioned to the F-15 Eagle program when the new fighter entered service in the mid-1970s. The F-15's engines were the first generation of the Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan, the same engine family that powered the F-16 sitting behind him on the tarmac at shore. Gerald spent 15 years maintaining F-100 engines. He worked through every variant, every modification, every technical order change. He became a technical sergeant, then a master sergeant. He was assigned as a quality assurance evaluator, the person who inspected other mechanics' work and certified that aircraft were safe to fly. He retired in 1996 after 30 years of active duty service with a shelf of commendation medals, 2 meritorious service medals, and a reputation among the maintenance community at every base he had served as the man who could fix what nobody else could fix. He had never sought promotion beyond master sergeant. He had never sought a commission. He had never sought any assignment that would take him away from the flight line and the engines. When people asked him why, he said the same thing every time. The jets need me more than the desk does. What the records also showed, and what Gerald had not mentioned to anyone at shore, was that Gerald's right hand had been partially disabled since 1969. During his second tour at Korat, a hydraulic line on an F-105 had ruptured during a post-flight inspection, sending a jet of hydraulic fluid at 3,000 pounds per square inch across his right hand. The fluid cut through his flight glove and severed 2 tendons. Military surgeons repaired what they could, but Gerald lost most of the grip strength and fine motor control in his right hand. He was offered a medical discharge. He refused it. He retrained himself to perform every maintenance task with his left hand dominant, a process that took him over a year and that his supervisors at the time said was the most determined thing they had ever witnessed. For the next 27 years of his Air Force career, Gerald Fisk maintained jet engines primarily with one fully functional hand. He had fixed tail number 88-0421 with his left hand not because he chose to, it was because that was the only hand he had. Colonel Prescott found Gerald sitting on a bench near the visitor centre, eating a sandwich from the box lunch that Moreno had distributed to the Heritage Tour group. He was alone. The other veterans were inside watching a video presentation about modern fighter operations. Gerald had apparently decided he had seen enough presentations for one day. Prescott sat down next to him and introduced herself. Gerald stood up when he realized she was a colonel, an instinct that 30 years of service had burned into his muscle memory, even though he had been out of uniform for nearly 3 decades. Prescott told him to sit. She asked about the engine. Gerald gave her the same understated explanation he had given everyone else. Stuck bleed air valve, carbon build-up, simple fix. Prescott asked him why he had not told anyone about his background when he first approached the aircraft. Gerald said it did not seem relevant. He said he saw a problem and wanted to help, and that his resume was not going to change what was wrong with the engine. Prescott studied him for a moment and then asked about his hand. Gerald looked down at his right hand, which was resting on his knee, the fingers slightly curled in the permanent partial contraction that 3 decades of scar tissue had created. He said it worked well enough. Prescott said she had read his service record in the last 30 minutes, and that well enough was not the phrase she would have chosen. Gerald did not respond to that. He took another bite of his sandwich. Prescott asked Gerald the same question that Colonel Voss at Fort Irwin once asked another old veteran in another parking lot at another base. She asked if he would be willing to come back. Not for a tour, not as a visitor. She wanted him to work with her maintenance squadron, specifically with the younger engine mechanics who were learning to troubleshoot the F-100 in an era where diagnostics were increasingly digital, increasingly automated, and increasingly disconnected from the physical, sensory, hands-on knowledge that had once been the foundation of aircraft maintenance. She said her people were excellent technicians who could follow a technical order and operate a diagnostic computer with precision. What they could not do, she said, was what Gerald had done that morning: look at an aircraft from 50 feet away and see what a computer could not see. Gerald said he would think about it. Unlike the sniper in California, he did not take 2 weeks. He called the next morning and said yes. Christine later told Prescott that it was the first time since Eleanor's death that she had heard her father sound like he had a reason to get out of bed. Gerald began visiting shore twice a month. He worked with the propulsion flight, the section responsible for F-100 engine maintenance. He did not come as a contractor or a consultant in any official capacity. Prescott arranged a volunteer mentor credential that gave him flight line access under escort, and Herrera personally served as his escort every visit. Gerald wore the same khakis and the same windbreaker every time. The airmen called him Mr. Fisk for the first visit. By the second visit, they called him Chief, the traditional term of respect for a retired senior NCO in the maintenance world, and Gerald did not correct them, which Herrera took as the highest possible compliment. Gerald taught the way he had always worked, quietly, precisely, and by example. He showed the young mechanics how to listen to an engine and hear the difference between a healthy compressor stage and one with developing blade erosion. He showed them how to feel for heat patterns on an exhaust casing that indicated uneven combustion. He showed them how to read oil color, smell fuel mixture quality, and detect a hydraulic leak by the way it changed the texture of the air near the aircraft. He showed them things that existed nowhere in any technical order, knowledge that lived only in the hands and ears and instincts of men who had learned by doing, under conditions that did not allow for second chances. He also taught them something else. He taught them to slow down. The modern maintenance environment was driven by metrics, sortie generation rates, aircraft availability percentages, maintenance man-hours per flight hour. Everything was measured. Everything was timed. Gerald watched the young mechanics rush through inspections to meet the numbers and told them, with the quiet authority of a man who had buried friends because of rushed maintenance, that speed was the enemy of thoroughness, and that a fast inspection that missed something was worse than no inspection at all. He told them about Korat, about working on F-105s that had come back from missions over Hanoi with battle damage that would have been fatal if the pre-flight inspection had missed a stress fracture or a loose fastener. He told them about standing on the flight line at 2 a.m, exhausted, covered in hydraulic fluid, with a pilot waiting in the cockpit and a mission clock running down, and still making himself check every fastener, every connection, every safety wire, because the man in that cockpit was going to fly into enemy fire on the strength of the work Gerald's hands had done. He said, "Every jet you touch has a person in it, a person who trusts you with their life. Don't you ever forget that. Not once, not ever." The effect on the propulsion flight was measurable. Over the next 2 quarters, engine-related maintenance discrepancies in the 20th Fighter Wing dropped by 14%. The first-time fix rate, the percentage of problems resolved correctly on the first attempt, increased by 22%. More importantly, the repeat discrepancy rate, problems that were signed off as fixed but came back, dropped to near zero. Captain Odom, who oversaw the maintenance data, showed the numbers to Colonel Prescott and said he had never seen anything like it. Prescott said it was because the airmen were not just following procedures anymore, they were understanding the machines. They were learning to think the way Gerald thought, to see the aircraft not as a collection of systems to be diagnosed by computer, but as a physical object that communicated its condition through sight, sound, smell, and touch if you knew how to pay attention. David Coe, the Pratt & Whitney field engineer who had recommended the 5-day teardown that turned out to be unnecessary, came back to shore 3 months later for a scheduled technical review. He sought Gerald out on the flight line and spent an entire afternoon talking to him. Coe was an engineer with a master's degree in aerospace propulsion from Georgia Tech. Gerald had a high school diploma and 30 years of turning wrenches. Coe later wrote in his trip report that Gerald Fisk possessed a working knowledge of the F-100 engine that was, in several specific areas, superior to anything in the company's own technical documentation. He recommended that Pratt & Whitney invite Gerald to their engine depot in Oklahoma City to consult on updating the F-100 troubleshooting manuals. Gerald went. He spent 3 days at the depot. He identified 11 gaps in the troubleshooting procedures, including the carbon buildup on the bleed air valve actuator track that had caused the problem at shore. Every one of his recommendations was incorporated into the next revision of the technical order. On Gerald's 1-year anniversary as a volunteer mentor at shore, Prescott held a small ceremony on the flight line. The propulsion flight formed up in front of Shelter 7, the same shelter where Gerald had fixed tail number 88-0421 with one hand and 4 seconds of knowledge that a room full of experts could not replicate. Prescott presented Gerald with the Air Force's Exemplary Civilian Service Award, a recognition typically reserved for paid government civilians with years of formal service. She had to request a waiver from the wing commander to present it to a volunteer. The waiver was approved in less than an hour. In her remarks, Prescott said that Gerald Fisk represented something that the modern Air Force was in danger of losing: the institutional knowledge carried by the men and women who built the force from the ground up, who learned their trade not from screens and manuals, but from metal and oil, and the unforgiving consequences of getting it wrong. She said the Air Force had the finest technology in the world, but that technology without the wisdom of experience was just machinery, and machinery without understanding was just weight. Gerald stood in front of the formation in his khakis and his windbreaker, and looked deeply uncomfortable. When Prescott pinned the medal to his jacket and shook his hand, Gerald said, "Thank you, Colonel, but this belongs to every mechanic who ever stayed late on the line because the jet wasn't right, and the pilot was counting on them." Then he looked at the young airmen in front of him and said, "You all have good hands and good heads. Trust them. The computers will tell you what might be wrong. Your hands will tell you what is wrong. Don't ever stop touching the airplane." Herrera, standing at the front of the formation, was the first to start clapping. It spread through the entire flight, then across the flight line to the crew chiefs and specialists who had stopped what they were doing to watch. Gerald stood there and let it happen, his left hand holding the medal citation, his right hand at his side where it had always been, damaged and scarred and still, after everything, the hand of a mechanic. There is a toolbox now on the propulsion flight line at Shaw Air Force Base. It is a standard snap-on roller cabinet, grey, unremarkable, identical to dozens of others on the flight line, but this one has a brass plate bolted to the top drawer. The plate reads, "In honor of Master Sergeant Gerald A. Fisk, U.S. Air Force, retired." The man who could hear what the engine was trying to say. Gerald's name is also on the updated Pratt & Whitney F-100 technical order, listed in the acknowledgements section of the troubleshooting revision as a contributing subject matter expert. It is the first time in the history of that document that a retired enlisted mechanic with no engineering degree has been credited by name. Gerald still comes to shore twice a month. He still wears the khakis and the windbreaker. He still walks the flight line with his eyes scanning every panel, every fastener, every inch of every aircraft he passes. The young airmen who see him for the first time sometimes ask who the old civilian is. The ones who have been there longer say the same thing every time. That's Chief Fisk. If he stops walking and looks at your jet, you better go ask him what he sees, because he sees things you and I won't learn to see for another 20 years. And somewhere on that flight line, tail number 88-0421 still flies. Its engine runs clean and smooth and strong, and every time it launches, it carries with it the echo of a moment when a 76-year-old man with one good hand and a lifetime of knowledge walked across a tarmac and reminded an entire squadron that there is no replacement for the person who truly knows the machine. If this story made you believe that mastery never retires and that the people who build things deserve to be remembered, subscribe to my channel. We find the stories that get overlooked about the quiet ones who kept the machines running and the missions flying and never once asked for applause. Share this with someone who works with their hands. They have earned it.